Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah. So now this is the third and final episode in our series on the history of the madhabs of fiqh. In episode 1, we looked at how fiqh evolved during the lifetime of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the first two generations of Muslims. That the Quran and Sunnah were revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, and he trained the Sahaba in the science of ijtihad, of deriving fiqh rulings. After he passed away, ijtihad was done on two levels. There was the political ijtihad done by the Khulafa Rashidin, and there was the day-to-day issues where ijtihad was done by the ulama like Abdullah ibn Umar, Aisha binti Abi Bakr, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, and many others, radiallahu anhum. Then, in the previous episode, we looked at how fiqh evolved during the later stages, from the second to the eighth generation of Islam. We looked at how fiqh began to become a science, and certain scholars became very famous in this field. So people began to attribute their names to those scholars if they followed their methodology in fiqh, and these became known as the madhabs of fiqh. So we looked at Imam Abu Hanifa, Ash-Shafi'i, Imam Malik, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, Dawud al-Zahiri, Sufyan al-Thawri, and many other great ulama, and how they established their own frameworks for fiqh, and how scholars of later generations would study the methodology of one of these scholars and build upon it and contribute to their madhab. So, in technical terms, we would say that the first four generations of ulama were in general called the mujtahid al-mutlaq, that they were people who were capable of doing ijtihad on their own. And then the next 10 generations uh, included, the great ulama of that time would be considered mujtahid fil madhab, that they followed a madhab, but they did ijtihad utilizing the principles of that madhab. Now, later on in our history, some people became very dogmatic about their madhabs. And this specifically happened with the Hanafi madhab in the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire. Why the Hanafi madhab specifically, I do not know. Because Imam Abu Hanifa was the most uh, rational. He was Ahlul Rai. He was the most free thinking, I would say, of the four Imams, in that he would actually listen to the opinions of his students and uh, didn't really consider his teachings to be something to be dogmatic about. Yet, for whatever reason, um, there was a lot of fanaticism around the Hanafi madhab in the late Ottoman era in both the Ottoman Empire and the Mughal Empire, and this has carried on to our time, specifically amongst the Indian Hanafis. There also came about some fanaticism towards the Shafi and Maliki madhabs, but not as much. For the most part, ijtihad did continue in small amounts amongst Shafi ulama, Malik ulama, and Hanbali ulama. But what happened mainly with the Hanafi ulama is that they adapted this idea that the doors of ijtihad are closed and that it's not permissible to make ijtihad anymore, and you just have to follow the opinions of those who came before you. And at some point, this became the state position of the Ottoman Empire to such an extent that ijtihad became illegal in the Ottoman Empire. That a Hanafi mufti, if he did his own ijtihad, he could be stripped of his position and even arrested for engaging in the crime of ijtihad. So huge changes took place in the Muslim world. While in the early years, those who engaged in ijtihad were considered heroes, in the later years they were considered criminals. And some of the reasons for these changes, there's psychological, social, and political reasons, but just to give you some of them, one reason is that, the world didn't change much for a long time. I know in our times we are used to radical change. The world is changing every year, every 5 years. But really, if you look at the way the world was from the, let's say, for example, the early Ottoman era till the late Ottoman era, not much really changed in the Muslim world. And for almost any issue that popped up, you could find a ruling in the books already written. You could find a ruling from the ulama of the past. So some of the ulama of that period, they came up with this idea that everything that needs to be written about has already been written about. So there's nothing more for us to contribute, let's just follow. And so they claim that the doors of ijtihad were closed and that we must just follow. Now, there is a false claim that there was consensus or ijma on the doors of ijtihad being closed. In reality, you will find in every generation ulama who spoke against us. Really, every generation, if you study the biographies of ulama, in every generation, there were ulama who disagreed with this idea of the doors of ijtihad being closed simply because new issues can come up. And especially in our time, when new issues are popping up every year, to still cling to this idea that the doors of ijtihad are closed is ridiculous. Because then we have no way of dealing with these new issues. So during the Ottoman era, there were ulama who believed that the doors of ijtihad were closed, and somehow this became a state policy where ijtihad became illegal, and the madhabs became like sects in some areas. In some cities and some countries, the madhabs really became like separate groups where people were very fanatical about their madhab being the right way and other madhabs being the wrong way. Blind support for the madhabs developed to the level that people would hate people of other madhabs. People would not pray salah behind people of other madhabs. Again, this wasn't in every part of the Muslim world. It really depended on the political climate and culture, but like in some parts of the Muslim world, like especially in India and in some parts of the Ottoman Empire, you see what happened. That it became very very fanatical. We see this even in the Hijaz, that there would be separate salahs for each madhab around the Kaaba, because people would only pray salah behind an imam from the same madhab as them, and madhab fanaticism became the norm. Ulama were forced to make taqleed, meaning you an alim of this era had to blindly follow. There was no room for ulama who did ijtihad. To such an extent that in the late Ottoman era, there actually were secret societies of mujtahids. Right? This is something I find quite bizarre, but there's a lot of documents coming out in recent times showing that in the late Ottoman era, in Syria, what we at that time we call Asham, and in Turkey, they were secret societies of mujtahids. That many of the great ulama of that period believed that ijtihad was necessary to deal with the technological changes of the time and the cultural and social changes of the time. So they would meet in secret and discuss these issues and do the ijtihad and find a way to get their opinions out into the public without people realizing that it's ijtihad. And there were even cases where they were caught out by spies and arrested for having these secret meetings and doing this ijtihad in secret. Really, really bizarre turn of events. But nonetheless, this is how things had fallen in the later eras, and the impact of this on the ummah. Uh, there's just so much you can talk about the impact of this on the ummah. The biggest impact this had was that the ummah fell behind the rest of the world. So during this time where ijtihad was prohibited, most of the ulama latched on to this idea that anything new, especially if it's coming from the kuffar, is haram, right? And whenever a new technology was invented, it would be declared haram. And it'd take a few generations before Muslims realize that, hold on, this isn't so bad. It is not necessarily haram. And then they would change their minds and say it's halal. And by the time they do so, they were, far behind the rest of the world. So we see this, the most famous example given in the books about this topic is the printing press. And this is the most famous example given. That when the Europeans invented the printing press, this was a game changer. Before that, the Muslim world had the most books because the Muslim world was full of scribes who would write books by hand. So there were books everywhere. But with the printing press, Europe could print books, or faster than any human could ever write. So they were just printing books and distributing it and growing it and selling it, and books became their culture. But the Muslim world at first rejected the concept of the printing press. Now, there's different reasons as to why they did it. Some say it's haram, some say it was the invention of the kuffar, some were worried to take jobs away from scribes. Some felt that, especially with the Quran, it had to be written by hand, it couldn't be written by a machine. Whatever reasons were given, the Ottoman Empire fell behind the rest of the world when it came to literature because it took them too long to adapt the printing press. We see this, for example, with armies, that while the rest of the world was moving towards a more modern army system, the Ottoman Empire still had the Janissary Corps, that at that point had become an outdated concept and was holding them back instead of moving them forward. We see this in many areas, even in later times, even in the modern times. We still have ulama with this mindset, and we see this again. Like when the radio was invented, many Muslim ulama said this is haram. This is tiny little jinn talking. This is magic. This is the voice of shaitan. And they rejected the radio. And it's only generations later that they say, okay, it's halal, and Muslim radio stations were set up. Same thing with video. When I was a child, we were taught that videos in all forms are haram. It's the Dajjal, it's the one eyed devil. And even watching a video like this, even watching a video of the haram, even watching a video lecture was considered haram. Yet within 20 years, that completely changed, and now there's Islamic video channels. We have Islamic YouTube channels, video courses, TV stations all over the world. But we've fallen behind the rest of the world. I mean, if we started at the same time as them, we'd be much higher in our production qualities. But we are catching up. We're still playing catch up, and this is our problem. So because of these ideas that developed in later times, this aversion towards new things, this fear of new things, uh, and this idea that anything new is haram, and taking generations to realize that it's not. Because of this, the Ummah is constantly playing catch up. And we're still stuck in that cycle of playing catch up with the rest of the world. You see why we need mujtahids. You see why we need mujtahids. Because when something new is invented, you hand it over to the mujtahids. They look at it, they analyze it in light of Quran, Sunnah, Usulul Fiqh, Maqasid, Qawaid. They analyze it in light of all of these things. And they give a very clear fatwa on whether it's halal or haram, not based on desires, not based on fear, but based on actual evidence. And then you can feel safer to follow that fatwa because you know it's not coming from a place of fear or desires, it's coming from actually following the methodology of the early generations. So the Ottoman Empire fell behind, and we see this even in the medical sciences. In the Abbasid era, Muslims were the global leaders of medicine, and the rest of the world studied medicine from the Muslims. We know that Ibn Sina's Qanun was the main textbook for medicine in the entire world for centuries. Yet in the late Ottoman era, again, because of this fear of of new things coming from the kuffar, they just declared any new medicines. They would be very skeptical to adapt it. Like one of the examples that I came across, and I'm not sure how authentic it is, but this is one of the examples mentioned, was that when blood transfers were invented and could have been used to save many people's lives, Ottoman muftis considered it haram because they said that blood is impure and you cannot put somebody else's blood in you. This was a fatwa that some people are attributed to the Ottoman muftis. Allah knows best how true it is, but when you look at the overall attitude towards fiqh at that time, it's plausible that also happened. I couldn't find any evidence to sustain whether that story is true or not. I did find it in many books, but those books didn't have a way of tracing the authenticity. So just take that story with a grain of salt. But nonetheless, what happened is that the Ottoman Empire started to fall behind, and Muslims became technologically backwards. And the ulama did not have the tools of ijtihad, so they were unable to deal with the new things that kept popping up. And it was during this period World War One takes place, the Ottoman Empire crumbles, the Muslim world is split into tiny countries ruled by the puppets set up by the West, and in the rubble of this war, in the fallout of this war, in the downfall of the Khilafat, Muslims took a step back and asked themselves, what went wrong. And they began to analyze what went wrong from a variety of perspectives. We discussed this in the other videos, the Aqidah, the political, all the other perspectives. But one of the perspectives they discussed it from is fiqh, that was closing the doors of ijtihad a bad thing? Was madhabs a bad thing? Could we have done something differently? And a variety of different responses popped up in the past 100 years that became new movements uh, and new responses to fiqh. So, two movements that are very new and really are a response to the downfall of the Khilafat and the closing of the doors of Ijtihad are the modernists and the Salafis. And what the modernists and Salafis had in common is that they both believed that closing the doors of Ijtihad were a mistake and this blind following of madhabs was a mistake. Where they differed is in what do we need to do next. So the Salafis called for abandoning the madhabs and going back to Quran and Sunnah. Or rather, to be more fair, there's different types of Salafis. Some of them, like the Ahlul Hadith, called for abandoning the madhabs and going back to Quran and Sunnah. Others called for reopening the doors of ijtihad within the madhabs. Right? So again, let's take your grain of salt. There are different types of Salafis. Some believe madhabs are good, but they need to reopen the doors of ijtihad and not be fanatical. Others believe that stop following the madhabs, go back to Quran and Sunnah, and have ulama who do ijtihad directly with Quran and Sunnah, which isn't necessarily a bad thing compared to the modernist reaction. The modernist reaction was that madhabs are bad, reopen the doors of ijtihad, come up with new usul, come up with new fiqh, so that Islam can catch up with the times. The problem with the modernist methodology was that it threw away everything. Right? It really just threw out the entire tradition and tried to invent a whole new tradition to replace it. And this new tradition was not based on sincerely following Quran and Sunnah, but rather it was based on trying to fit Islam into the modern world. Now, both of these movements actually go back a few hundred years. And we only really see them becoming something popular in the past 100 years after the downfall of the Khilafat. But if you go back about 150 years ago to the 19th century, when the British conquered Egypt, there was in Egypt a mufti by the name of Muhammad Abduh, and he called for the reopening of the doors of Ijtihad. And he called for doing away with these madhabs and going directly to Quran and Sunnah and going back to the way of the Salaf and for coming up with a new fiqh. And he's a very strange character in history because in a way he was the first Salafi, in a way he was the first modernist. Like he used this terminology of going back to the way of the Salaf and reopening the doors of Ijtihad. But his fatwas were not in line with Quran and Sunnah. His fatwas were more in line with the modernist movement of today. So, for example, he tried to ban the niqab and ban polygamy, and he gave rationalization for dealing with riba, with interest. So he was more of a modernist, even though he used the what would later become Salafi terminology. Muhammad Abdul's students, they split up into opposing camps. There was Rashad Rida, who really was the first person to use the Salafi term a lot to refer to himself. And he was more sympathetic towards the uh, return to the Quran and Sunnah. And he tried to curb some of his teachers' more radical positions. And really, you could say that it is from the students of Muhammad Abdul that these two movements came about. That some of his students went more into the modernizing of the religion, and some of the others went more into the Quran and Sunnah, return to the Quran and Sunnah part of this movement. And they split up. And some of them started calling themselves modernists, others started calling themselves Salafis. And so what happened was about 50 years ago, the University of Medina was established. It's actually a very new university, it's not an old university. Just about 50 years ago, the University of Medina was established and they needed teachers. So many of the Salafi teachers from Egypt migrated to Medina to teach in the university. And there, the Wahhabi movement of Saudi Arabia and the Salafi movement of Egypt merged together into one movement. So the Aqidah of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was preached, along with the Egyptian Salafi method of going back to Quran and Sunnah and not following a madhab. And then this new form of Salafism that we only saw rise up from the 1980s onwards until today. This form of Salafism came exclusively from the graduates of the Medina University, because that's where these two movements merged into one and became the modern Salafi movement. Now, to be fair, these movements did bring some good to the world. They did reopen the doors of ijtihad, which was necessary for dealing with the problems of our time. The Salafi movement specifically did a lot of work into authenticating hadiths and doing away with fabricated hadiths, which is very necessary for us to move forward with our fiqh in our times. Um, they did, for example, revive the science of Maqasid al-Sharia and the study of Maqasid, which is necessary for our times. However, the modernists went too far and the Salafis went too strict. I think that's probably the best way to explain it. That the modernists went too far. That they, with each generation, just got more and more bizarre with the interpretations of the religion. That no matter how far the West went to the left, they went with them. So when the West started saying polygamy is bad, they're like, yes, polygamy is bad. When they started saying that women shouldn't wear hijab, they started saying yes, women shouldn't wear hijab. And when they started saying that being homosexual is fine, the modernists are saying yes, being homosexual is fine. And it doesn't end. The more bizarre and left and what's the word, liberal the modern world is becoming, the more this group goes with them, and the deeper and deeper into kufr that they are going. They've reached such a level that you can't even consider many of them Muslims today. Their opinions they hold are so far away from the Quran and Sunnah and Ijma. Honestly, you can't even consider them to be Muslims. Like, I wouldn't pray Salah behind them. The Salafis, on the other hand, they should be uh, given credit for reviving the science of hadith authentication, reviving the importance of Quran and Sunnah, the importance of studying tafsir, the importance of ijtihad, and they definitely played a role in that. But they did go too strict and too far, and they became like a group, like a sect to such an extent that in many parts of the world they cut themselves off from everybody else, and they have their own clique and their own ulama, and they don't follow anyone else or talk to anyone else, and then they split up into smaller and smaller groups that are fighting each other. This is the problem that afflicted this movement. Right today, we have like 5 or 6 different types of Salafis, even though this movement literally just popped up like 50 years ago. In those 50 years, they just split up into more and more and more groups. So, I'll give you an example of some of the splits. Uh, in the 1980s, the Salafis split over the concept of jihad. That some of them took up this position that the rulers of the Muslim world are disbelievers for supporting the Western powers and allying against the Muslims. And they declared jihad on the Muslim rulers. And this is where the Salafi jihadi movement came from, that would later manifest itself and grew more and more extreme with Al Qaeda and then ISIS, right? But those are actually offshoots of Salafism. That from the Salafis came a group of Salafis who believed that you need to make it jihad against these rulers. And from that group of Salafis, each generation got more extreme and more uh, extreme jihadist movements came about until it reached its, I would say, its worst point with ISIS. And since then, that movement kind of died out because people realized that, hold on, this is extreme, this is bad, right? But that was the first split, and they split amongst themselves. So like the Al Qaeda called the ISIS extremists, right? Because they're just going further and further, like how the modernists were going further and further to the left. These guys are going further and further towards into violence. And another split that took place amongst the Salafis was in the 90s, in how to deal with political errors from their rulers. So remember, the Salafi movement started in Saudi Arabia, and in the 90s, they split amongst themselves on the fact that Saudi Arabia had allied with the West and allowed America to set up bases in Saudi. So, can they criticize this or not? Are they allowed to criticize their leaders? This became the next point of split amongst the Salafis. And from this came the more political Salafis like Salman al-Auda, may Allah hasten his release, and others like him who were outspoken against the government and paid the price for it. He's in prison at the time of recording for years. May Allah grant him sabr and grant him, the full reward for his patience and grant him release. And then there came another group that said, no, you can never criticize the rulers. People call them the Madkhalis. They adapted this position that part of being a Salafi is you can never criticize the rulers of Saudi Arabia. And so they became very fanatical about that and would kick anyone out of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah if they spoke a bad word against the ruler. And they became like blind followers of the ruler. And this became another split amongst the Salafis. So they split up into more and more groups. And just like how the modernists went deeper and deeper into uh, following the liberal West, the Salafis went deeper and deeper into sectarianism and splitting up amongst themselves. A third approach, which I didn't write here, that popped up, that continued during this time, was the approach of just blind following. So right till today, there are some Muslims who still believe the doors of ijtihad are closed. Just follow what's in the books, and Allah will sort things out for us. So this group doesn't believe in finding solutions. They don't believe in making ijtihad. They don't believe that we're capable of making ijtihad. They simply believe, sit and wait. It's the end of the world. Mahdi is coming. He'll sort everything out for us. Right? And unfortunately, you can still find Muslims like that in most parts of the world. So this became the third approach, right? Which is instead of learning from the mistakes that contributed to the downfall of the Ottoman Empire, they just say this is Qadarullah and we'll wait for the Mahdi. Nothing else we can do. So that group continues with just memorization and blind following and passing on knowledge from one generation to the next in the form of memorization and blind following. And they do not get involved in politics, they do not get involved in ijtihad, they do not get involved in dealing with new issues. They just stick with themselves. They just stick to teaching the next generation what they learned from their forefathers. And their hope is that the Mahdi will come and solve everything for us. Then we have the fourth and final approach. And I believe that this is the right approach, the balanced approach. So what's going to help the Ummah get back on top and inshallah get out of this period of decline and establish a new period of hope and power for this Ummah, is that we have to go back at least to the issue of ijtihad within the madhab. Right? If someone feels that we can't have mujtahids today on the same caliber and level as the first three generations, okay, but can't we at least have mujtahids who work within their madhabs, who use the framework of the madhabs, the usul, the maqasid, the qawaid to solve contemporary issues, to develop fiqh for their times? Shouldn't we be training our ulama to at least be on that level? So this is an approach that developed in the past 100 years, that people realize, hold on, this blind following thing's not working. We need to do ijtihad. We need to focus on revival of ijtihad amongst the ulama. Otherwise, we are not going to be able to deal with new issues as they arise. We actually see voices speaking about this even 300 years ago with Shah Waliullah Dehlawi, rahimahullah, from India. Remember, I said that this blind following of the Hanafi madhab reached its worst point in India. And in India, it became a point of sectarianism, where people followed, the opinions of the ulama as if it was Quran and Sunnah. And 300 years ago, Shah Waliullah wrote his famous book Hujjatullah al-Baligha, where he called for the revival of ijtihad, where he called on ulama. He said, you're not a real alim unless you can do ijtihad. Where he called on the ulama of the Hanafi and the Shafi and the Maliki madhabs, and he told them that you need to be capable of ijtihad so that you can deal with the problems of your time, so you can solve the new issues that are popping up. Because he lived in a time when the world was changing, where British colonialism was on its way, and India was losing its power. Remember, Muslims ruled India for a long, long time. The Delhi Sultanate and the Mughal Sultanate, but then the British took over. And he was living in that time where those changes were happening. He saw the changes were happening. He realized the importance of ijtihad, and he called for the revival of the doors of ijtihad even then 300 years ago. And after him, many others did as well. In every generation after that, you will find great ulama saying we need to reopen the doors of ijtihad, otherwise we're not going to be able to deal with the problems of our time. And we see this, for example, with the great Maliki scholar of Tunisia, Ibn Ashur, rahimahullah, right? The big tafsir book behind me, written by him less than 100 years ago. It's a masterpiece, the greatest tafsir work of this generation, of the 20th century. So Ibn Ashur, rahimahullah, was a giant. He was really uh, like the first real mujtahid of the 20th century. And he was a Maliki scholar. But he believed ulama, even though they attribute themselves to madhabs, even though they follow the framework of a madhab, they must do ijtihad. So he wrote a book on maqasid al-sharia, on the goals of the sharia. And his book really is one of the most important books written in the past 100 years. It changed my entire approach to fiqh and my entire understanding of the subject. And I know many others who were changed by that book as well. And by the way, it has been translated into English, so I highly recommend getting a hold of the translation of Ibn Ashur's book on Maqasid al-Sharia and reading it for yourself. But he called for this. He called for the ulama to train in a mazhab, to become masters of their mazhab, to become scholars of their mazhab, but to build themselves up to a level where they can do ijtihad. So their mazhab is able to solve contemporary issues, which is what fiqh was supposed to be all about. The whole reason why Allah revealed to us such a religion that would remain the true religion until the end of time, and He revealed it in this way, where it included the process of ijtihad and usul al-fiqh, all of this, was so that Islam would solve the problems of each generation. If Allah wanted to just blindly follow a set of laws, He would have given us a manual, a 10-volume manual of all the laws to follow. But instead, He revealed a system that was dynamic and flexible and had this built-in structures for dealing with issues, so that ulama would do ijtihad and solve the issues of their time. And this, I believe, is the method that's needed now. That the ulama of our time, they need to study a madhab, Shafi, Hanbali, Maliki, Hanafi, whichever one it is, but they need to build themselves up to a level where they are able to do ijtihad, at least in some areas. So maybe one person becomes a mujtahid in the field of economics, and somebody else becomes a mujtahid in the field of family law, and someone else becomes a mujtahid in the field of politics, and they are able to contribute to the discussion. How do we solve contemporary economic issues, things like mortgages and insurance and interest-based banking and all of this? How do we solve family issues in the modern world? The effects of feminism on the Muslim marriage, and this culture uh, where divorce is rampant. And how do we solve these things? What are the fiqh solutions that could fix these things? Someone to solve the political issues. What do the khilafat look like in the 21st century? How can we get there? What would be the fiqh or the siyasa, the political laws of a Muslim khilafat if it were to exist in the 21st century? We need ulama who can work this out. And this is where we are, right? We are at a crossroads. Really, we are at the crossroads in the history of Islam. And we ask Allah to help this ummah, to guide this ummah, to revive the glory and the majesty of this ummah, and to make it great again. As you can see over this three-part history, Islam started as something great, and Islam is still great. Muslims are the ones who are down. But Islam started as this force for change. And we see it changing the world radically in the time of the Khulafa Rashideen and the Umayyads and the Abbasids and even the early Ottomans. But in the past 400 years, Muslims took their religion for granted. People became lazy in this area. People became fanatical and dogmatic and sectarian in this area. And the entire Ummah suffered for this. We are now at a point where we have to decide, how do we move forward. Different people have taken up different approaches. I can say for sure the modernist approach is batil. It's evil. It is going to lead this ummah astray. It is something that has to be rejected and spoken out against and warned about, because that is the deviant sect of our time. It's the same with the jihadist approach of violently taking over Muslim lands and killing Muslims for not following you and calling people disbelievers for not being part of your movement, just as evil, just as bad, and needs to be spoken against and warned about. In between these two extremes, in between them, we have those who are still blindly following, and maybe that protects their iman, but it's not going to benefit the rest of the ummah if they don't produce ulama that can solve the problems of our time. We have those who follow a madhab, but the ulama are learning to do ijtihad and solve contemporary issues. Our hopes are with them. And they're the Salafi ulama, who are calling people to go back to the Quran and Sunnah, and part of that call is reviving the doors of ijtihad, and they have produced mujtahids. They have produced mujtahids, right? Whether you agree with their fatwas or not, but really there have been some great ulama that have come out of this movement in the past 50 years. Really, the solution has to come from the middle. The solution has to come from one of these middle groups, or all of these middle groups working together. Those who work within the tradition, who call towards Quran and Sunnah, whether they're following a madhab or not, but they respect the tradition and they acknowledge it and they study it and they work within it to find solutions. That's where the solution is going to come from. So we end this series by asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to restore the glory and dignity of this ummah, to raise from amongst us ulama who can solve our problems and who are capable of ijtihad and who can guide this ummah forward. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect us from deviation, from extremism in all its forms, and from the deviant sects of our time. Jazakallah khairan for your time and attention. I hope you benefited from this 3-part series. Subhana rabbika rabbil izzati amma yasifun. Wassalamu ala mursaleen walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.